The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees surrounding Preston Academy, one of the most prestigious private schools in the city. The annual Academic Excellence ceremony was in full swing, with luxury cars pulling up to the beautifully decorated entrance. Parents in designer outfits walked confidently through the doors, their heels clicking against the polished marble floors. Among the students present was a bright young girl named Michelle Chen, who had earned the highest GPA in her class. She stood near the refreshment table, wearing a simple but elegant navy blue dress her mother had helped her pick out for the occasion. While other students clustered in groups, chatting and laughing, Michelle found herself alone, taking small sips from her punch cup and observing the room. The grand hall was decorated with the school's colors. Crimson and gold banners hung from the ceiling, and elaborate flower arrangements adorned every table. The air was filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the occasional tinkling of crystal glasses. Everything seemed perfect, exactly as these events usually were, until Mrs. Richardson arrived. Mrs. Richardson was well known in school circles, the type of parent who treated the school as her personal kingdom. Her designer handbag probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her perfectly styled hair never had a strand out of place. She was accompanied by her usual group of parent friends, all members of the school's elite social circle. The moment Mrs. Richardson spotted Michelle standing alone by the refreshment table, her perfectly painted lips curved into a frown. She whispered something to her friends, who all turned to look at Michelle with barely concealed disdain. Then, with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her life, Mrs. Richardson began walking toward Michelle. "Excuse me," Mrs. Richardson's voice cut through the ambient chatter like a knife. "This is a private event. The catering staff should be using the back entrance." Her words were loud enough to draw attention from nearby parents and students. Michelle felt her cheeks burn as she realized what was happening. "I'm not catering staff," she said quietly but firmly. "I'm a student here. I'm actually receiving an award tonight." Mrs. Richardson's eyes narrowed as she looked Michelle up and down. "Really? I've never seen you at any of our events before. And I know all the parents here." The implied meaning behind her words was clear. She didn't believe Michelle belonged. A few other parents had stopped their conversations to watch the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed almost entertained by the drama, but none stepped forward to help. Michelle could see her classmates whispering to each other, and a few had their phones out, likely recording the interaction. "I've been at Preston Academy for 3 years," Michelle explained, her voice remaining steady despite her racing heart. "I'm in the Advanced Placement Program, and I'm receiving the Academic Excellence Award tonight." This only seemed to agitate Mrs. Richardson more. "Listen, young lady, I don't know how you got in here, but this is a private event for Preston Academy families only. I'm on the school board, and I know every student who's receiving an award tonight." Michelle reached into her small purse and pulled out her student ID card, but Mrs. Richardson waved it away dismissively. "Anyone can fake an ID these days. I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call security." The tension in the room was palpable. Michelle could feel dozens of eyes on her, judging, wondering, some pitying. She thought about all the late nights studying, all the extra credit projects, all the hard work that had earned her place at this ceremony. She wasn't going to let anyone take this moment from her. "I won't leave," Michelle said, her voice stronger now. "I earned my place here. My father will be arriving shortly, and he can confirm everything I'm telling you." Mrs. Richardson's perfectly manicured hand reached for her phone. "Well, then we'll just wait for security to escort you out. This is exactly why we need to be more careful about who we let into these events." More students had gathered around now, many of them Michelle's classmates who knew exactly who she was. A few looked like they wanted to speak up, but Mrs. Richardson's influence over the school board made them hesitate. She was known for making life difficult for anyone who crossed her. What Mrs. Richardson didn't know was that Michelle's father wasn't just any parent. He was Dr. Chen, one of the most respected neurosurgeons in the country, and a member of the hospital board that Mrs. Richardson's husband answered to. He had just finished an emergency surgery and was on his way to see his daughter receive her award. The sound of expensive shoes on marble floors echoed through the hall, and heads began to turn toward the entrance. Mrs. Richardson was still focused on her phone, threatening to call security, unaware that her entire world was about to shift dramatically. Michelle could see her father's car pulling up through the large windows of the grand hall. She knew that in just moments, Mrs. Richardson would learn a valuable lesson about making assumptions. But more importantly, Michelle had learned something too, that sometimes staying calm and standing your ground was the best response to ignorance. The tension in the room continued to build as Mrs. Richardson's voice grew louder, drawing even more attention to the situation. Students were now openly recording the incident on their phones, and whispers rippled through the crowd as they spotted Dr. Chen's distinctive car pulling up to the entrance. Michelle felt a mix of emotions: embarrassment at being the center of attention, anger at being treated this way, but also a strange sense of peace knowing that justice was about to be served in the most elegant way possible. She had always been taught to handle difficult situations with grace, and now she understood why. The doors to the grand hall were about to open, and with them, a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving and assumptions can be dangerous. The annual Academic Excellence ceremony was about to become memorable for reasons no one had expected, especially not Mrs. Richardson. This moment would later be remembered as a turning point in Preston Academy's history. The day when silent discrimination faced its reckoning, and when a young student's dignity proved stronger than social prejudice. But for now, all eyes were on the entrance, waiting to see what would happen next as the clicking of shoes grew closer and closer to the door. As the tension in Preston Academy's grand hall reached its peak, Michelle stood her ground, her hands clasped tightly around her student ID. Despite the humiliation of being publicly questioned, she remembered her mother's words from years ago: "Your dignity isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you respond to that treatment." Looking around the room, Michelle could see various reactions playing out on people's faces. Her chemistry teacher, Mr. Thompson, was shifting uncomfortably near the podium, clearly torn between wanting to help and fearing Mrs. Richardson's influence. A group of seniors from her advanced calculus class were huddled together, whispering and occasionally glancing her way with sympathetic looks. "I really don't want to make a scene," Michelle said calmly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm scheduled to receive the Academic Excellence Award tonight. You can check with any of the teachers here." She gestured toward Mr. Thompson, who suddenly became very interested in adjusting his tie. Mrs. Richardson's face tightened, her perfectly applied makeup creasing around her eyes. "I don't need to check with anyone. I've been on this school board for 8 years, and I've never seen you at any of our events. This is a prestigious ceremony, not some public school gathering." The words stung, but Michelle refused to let them break her composure. She thought about all the times she'd stayed up late studying while her friends were out at parties. She remembered the weekends spent in the library, the countless practice tests, and the extra credit projects that had earned her this moment. "Actually," Michelle responded, her voice clear enough for nearby guests to hear, "I've been here for every honor roll ceremony since freshman year. I was also part of the team that won the state science championship last spring. My picture is actually on the wall of achievements near the principal's office." A few students nodded in confirmation, but Mrs. Richardson wasn't interested in facts that contradicted her assumptions. She pulled out her phone, manicured fingers tapping the screen aggressively. "I'm calling security right now. This is exactly why we need stricter policies about who can enter these events." Michelle could feel her phone buzzing in her purse, probably her father texting to let her know he was almost there. She took a deep breath, knowing she just needed to hold on for a few more minutes. The irony wasn't lost on her that while Mrs. Richardson was trying to remove her from the ceremony, her name was printed in gold letters on the award certificate waiting to be presented. Some of the other parents had begun to look uncomfortable with the situation. Mrs. Lee, whose daughter was in Michelle's study group, took a half step forward before her husband gently pulled her back. The weight of Mrs. Richardson's influence was evident in their collective silence. "If you could just wait a few minutes," Michelle tried again. "My father is on his way. He's just finishing up at the hospital." "Oh, now your father works at the hospital." Mrs. Richardson's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Let me guess, he's a janitor. Or maybe he delivers supplies." She turned to her friends, clearly expecting them to join in her amusement. The casual cruelty of the comment sent a ripple of discomfort through the crowd. Even some of Mrs. Richardson's usual supporters shifted awkwardly, perhaps finally recognizing that this had gone too far. Michelle felt a flash of anger, not just for herself, but for every hard-working person Mrs. Richardson had just insulted. Her voice remained level as she replied, "Every job at a hospital is important. But since you asked, my father is actually." "I don't care what your father does," Mrs. Richardson interrupted, raising her phone to her ear. "Security? Yes, we have an uninvited guest at the Academic Excellence ceremony who's refusing to leave." The grand hall had grown unnaturally quiet. The soft classical music playing in the background seemed jarringly inappropriate for the drama unfolding. Michelle could see some of her classmates still recording everything on their phones, while others looked away in embarrassment. Principal Walker had appeared at the edge of the crowd, but even he seemed hesitant to intervene. Mrs. Richardson's husband was a major donor to the school, and her influence extended far beyond just the Parent-Teacher Association. Michelle straightened her shoulders and took another small sip of her punch, the simple action a quiet declaration that she wasn't going anywhere. She thought about all the other students who might face similar situations in the future. Her response now wasn't just about herself, it was about setting a precedent. "The ceremony starts in 15 minutes, Michelle said quietly, more to herself than to Mrs. Richardson. "My father will be here any moment." Mrs. Richardson was still on the phone, describing Michelle to security as if she was some kind of threat. "Yes, she's claiming to be a student, but I've never seen her before. We need someone here immediately." Through the large windows, Michelle could see her father's car pulling into the parking lot. She allowed herself a small smile, knowing that the next few minutes would change everything. Not because her father was going to solve her problems for her, but because she had stood her ground with dignity and truth on her side. The sound of footsteps in the marble hallway outside grew louder, but it wasn't security approaching. It was someone whose presence would turn this uncomfortable scene into a powerful lesson about prejudice and presumption. Michelle watched as several heads turned toward the entrance, recognition dawning on their faces. The tension in the room had reached its peak. Mrs. Richardson was still focused on her phone call, unaware that her moment of reckoning was approaching. Michelle felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She had handled this situation exactly as her parents had taught her, with grace under pressure and unwavering self-respect. In these final moments before her father's arrival, Michelle realized that this evening would be memorable not just for her academic achievement, but for something far more important. It would be remembered as a moment when quiet dignity proved stronger than loud prejudice, when assumptions met reality, and when the true meaning of belonging would be demonstrated in the most unexpected way. The heavy wooden doors of the grand hall began to open, and Michelle could see Mrs. Richardson's face, still set in its mask of superiority, completely unaware that her world was about to shift dramatically. The evening's real lesson was about to begin, and it had nothing to do with academic excellence. The tension in Preston Academy's grand hall had reached a fever pitch. The classical music playing softly through the speakers seemed almost comical now, a stark contrast to the drama unfolding by the refreshment table. Students had formed a loose circle around Michelle and Mrs. Richardson, their phones held high to capture every moment of the unfolding situation. Mrs. Richardson was still on her phone with security, her voice growing increasingly shrill. "Yes, I need someone here immediately. This is completely unacceptable. Do you know who I am?" She paced back and forth in her designer heels, each step echoing against the marble floor. Through the large windows, Michelle could see her father's familiar car pulling into his usual parking spot, the one reserved for hospital board members. She noticed how his parking choice alone was about to become an interesting detail in this story. Several students who had been watching through the windows suddenly straightened up, their expressions changing from curiosity to surprise. "Security is on their way," Mrs. Richardson announced triumphantly, finally ending her call. "I suggest you leave now before you're escorted out. This will be much less embarrassing for you." She smoothed her expensive blazer, clearly pleased with herself. Michelle checked the time on her phone, just 12 minutes until the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Her name was listed in the program, printed in elegant script. Academic Excellence Award. Highest grade point average. The program sat on a table near the entrance, ready to be handed out to guests. The crowd around them had grown larger. Teachers who had taught Michelle for years stood awkwardly at the edges, their discomfort visible in their shifting postures and averted gazes. A few of them had seen her perfect test scores, had written her glowing recommendations for college applications, yet none found the courage to speak up against Mrs. Richardson's authority. "You know," Michelle said quietly, "when I first came to Preston Academy, I was worried about fitting in. But I learned that excellence speaks for itself." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. "This is my acceptance letter to the summer research program at Johns Hopkins. I was going to show it to my teachers tonight." Mrs. Richardson's eyes narrowed at the envelope, but she waved it away dismissively. "Anyone can forge documents these days. I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, but it won't work here." The sound of car doors closing outside drew more students to the windows. Someone gasped audibly. Michelle could hear the whispers starting. "Isn't that? Oh my God, look at the car. Mrs. Richardson has no idea." The principal had finally begun making his way through the crowd, perhaps realizing that this situation had spiraled beyond what was acceptable. But before he could reach them, Mrs. Richardson launched into another tirade. "This is exactly what's wrong with society today," she declared loudly, playing to her audience of uncertain onlookers. "People thinking they can just walk in anywhere, claim anything. This is a private school, not some community center." The click of the main doors opening echoed through the hall. Michelle noticed how the crowd near the entrance began to part automatically, the way they always did when someone of importance entered the room. She could see Mrs. Richardson's friends trying to get her attention, their faces showing increasing panic. "Mrs. Richardson," Michelle tried one last time, "my father is actually—" "I don't care who your father is." Mrs. Richardson snapped, her voice bouncing off the high ceiling. "This is about maintaining standards, about protecting what we've built here, about keeping Preston Academy exclusive and—" She never finished that sentence. The sudden silence that fell over the grand hall was deafening. Even the classical music seemed to have stopped at just the right moment. The only sound was the steady, confident footsteps approaching from behind Mrs. Richardson. Michelle watched as the color drained from the faces of Mrs. Richardson's friends. They began backing away slowly, their designer shoes shuffling against the marble floor. The students' phones were still recording, capturing every second of what was about to become one of the most talked-about moments in Preston Academy's history. Through the windows, everyone could now clearly see the car in the reserved parking space, the same car they'd seen on local news channels and in newspaper articles. The same car that belonged to one of the hospital's most renowned doctors, a man whose reputation extended far beyond their city's borders. Mrs. Richardson, still oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, reached for her phone again. "Where is security? This is ridiculous. I'm going to have to speak to the board about updating our entrance policies. We clearly need better screening procedures." The footsteps stopped directly behind her. Michelle saw her father's reflection in the window, still wearing his hospital ID badge and the supple confidence that came from saving lives on a daily basis. He had that look on his face, the one he got when he was about to deliver an important lesson. The crowd held its collective breath. Phones were raised higher, making sure to capture every angle of what was about to happen. Even the teachers had moved closer, unable to resist watching this moment unfold. Principal Walker, who had finally made his way through the crowd, suddenly looked very pale. He knew exactly who had just walked in, and more importantly, he knew exactly how much influence that person had over the school's future. Mrs. Richardson continued her rant, gesturing dramatically with her manicured hands, completely unaware that her entire world was about to shift on its axis. "This is a perfect example of why we need to be more selective, more exclusive, more." "More what, Mrs. Richardson?" The voice behind her was calm, measured, and carried the weight of authority that came from years of making life-and-death decisions. It was a voice that everyone in the room recognized, everyone except Mrs. Richardson. The evening was about to teach lessons far more valuable than any that could be found in Preston Academy's expensive textbooks. As Mrs. Richardson slowly turned around, the entire room held its breath, waiting to witness what would happen next. The real education was about to begin. Mrs. Richardson seemed to shrink with each word. Her designer outfit and perfectly styled hair suddenly looked less impressive next to Dr. Chen's surgical scrubs and slightly rumpled white coat, clothing he'd worn while actually saving lives. "I apologize," she finally managed to say, though her eyes darted around, looking for an escape route. "I never meant to." "To what?" Dr. Chen asked quietly. "To publicly humiliate a student, to make assumptions based on appearance, to threaten a young person with security because they didn't fit your image of what belongs here." The questions hung in the air, each one landing like a carefully placed surgical cut. Several of Mrs. Richardson's former supporters were now studying their shoes intently, perhaps reconsidering their own behaviors and assumptions. Principal Walker finally found his voice. "Dr. Chen, please know that this incident does not reflect the values of Preston Academy. We're incredibly proud of Michelle's achievements and we—" "Aren't you?" Dr. Chen interrupted politely. "Because I watched several teachers who know my daughter's academic record stand silently while she was treated this way." His words caused several faculty members to wince visibly. Michelle touched her father's arm gently. "Dad, the ceremony is about to start." Dr. Chen nodded, then turned back to Mrs. Richardson. "My daughter worked hard to earn her place here. She spent countless hours studying while I was in surgery. She earned this moment. And you?" He paused, looking directly at Mrs. Richardson. "You tried to take that away from her without a second thought." The grand hall remained silent, every person present understanding they were witnessing something significant. This wasn't just about one incident or one student, it was about the values they claimed to teach versus the ones they actually demonstrated. "The ceremony will begin shortly," Dr. Chen announced to the room at large. "I suggest we all take our seats and celebrate the actual achievements of these remarkable students. After all, isn't that why we're here?" As people began moving toward their assigned seats, many were whispering about what they'd just witnessed. Mrs. Richardson stood frozen, her social standing visibly crumbling around her. The evening had taken an unexpected turn, delivering lessons that weren't on any school curriculum. Michelle and her father walked toward their seats, heads held high, leaving Mrs. Richardson to contemplate the consequences of her actions. The ceremony was about to begin, but everyone knew the real teaching moment had already taken place. As the first notes of the processional music began to play, the atmosphere in the grand hall had shifted dramatically. Tonight's ceremony would be remembered not just for academic achievements, but for a powerful lesson about dignity, assumptions, and the true meaning of excellence. As the crowd settled into their seats for the academic excellence ceremony, the atmosphere in Preston Academy's grand hall remained charged with tension. The elegant program booklets being passed around seemed almost ironic now, their gold-embossed letters spelling out excellence in all things, taking on a new meaning after what had just transpired. Mrs. Richardson remained rooted to her spot near the refreshment table, her usual confidence shattered. Her phone, which she had been so eager to use for calling security earlier, now hung limply in her manicured hand. Several parents who normally flocked to her side had mysteriously found seats as far away as possible. Dr. Chen guided Michelle to their reserved seats in the front row, where places had been kept for award recipients and their families. As they walked past other parents and students, whispers followed in their wake. Several teachers now made a point of warmly greeting Michelle, their earlier silence weighing heavily on their consciences. Dr. Chen, the head of the science department, called out, hurrying over. "I just wanted to tell you that Michelle's research project on neuroplasticity was one of the finest we've ever seen. She'll make an excellent neurosurgeon one day." Mrs. Richardson, who could hear every word, seemed to shrink further into herself. The irony of her earlier comments about Dr. Chen's presumed occupation wasn't lost on anyone. Principal Walker approached the podium, clearing his throat nervously. The microphone feedback echoed through the hall, causing several people to wince. "Before we begin tonight's ceremony," he started, his voice shaking slightly, "I want to emphasize that Preston Academy values diversity, inclusion, and—" Dr. Chen raised his hand politely, interrupting the principal's damage control attempt. "Perhaps we should focus on celebrating the students' achievements tonight. That's why we're all here, isn't it?" The principal nodded gratefully, clearly relieved to avoid addressing the earlier incident directly. He shuffled his papers and began the ceremony proper, reading out the names of honor roll students. Meanwhile, Mrs. Richardson had finally found her seat, though nobody rushed to sit next to her. Her usual allies were suddenly very interested in their program booklets or their phones. The social dynamics of the room had shifted dramatically in the space of a few minutes. As various awards were presented, students walked across the stage to receive their certificates. Each time they passed Mrs. Richardson's row, they seemed to walk a little taller, as if realizing that social status wasn't the only measure of worth. Halfway through the ceremony, Mrs. Richardson's phone buzzed loudly. Everyone nearby could see the caller ID. It was her husband, the hospital administrator who worked under Dr. Chen. Her hands trembled as she declined the call, probably realizing the professional implications of her actions were just beginning to unfold. When it was finally time for the Academic Excellence Award, Principal Walker's voice grew stronger. This year's highest academic achievement goes to a student who has maintained a perfect GPA while participating in numerous advanced placement courses and research programs. Michelle rose from her seat, her simple navy dress suddenly looking more elegant than any designer outfit in the room. As she walked toward the stage, several students started applauding enthusiastically, not just for her academic achievement, but for the grace she'd shown earlier. Dr. Chen watched his daughter with quiet pride. His surgical scrubs and white coat stood out among the formal wear, but somehow they seemed more impressive than any expensive suit. He'd come straight from saving a life to support his daughter, a fact that made Mrs. Richardson's earlier assumptions even more embarrassing. As Michelle accepted her award, she paused at the microphone. "I'd like to thank my teachers, my fellow students, and especially my father, who taught me that true excellence isn't about who you know or what you wear. It's about how you treat others and what you contribute to the world." The applause that followed was thunderous. Several teachers wiped tears from their eyes, while students who had recorded the earlier incident quickly captured this moment too. Even Mrs. Richardson's friends were clapping, though they carefully avoided looking in her direction. After the ceremony, parents and students mingled during the reception. Dr. Chen and Michelle found themselves surrounded by well-wishers. Several parents who had remained silent during Mrs. Richardson's earlier behavior now approached to congratulate them, their faces showing a mix of admiration and shame. Mrs. Richardson stood alone near the exit, her designer handbag clutched tightly to her chest. She watched as teachers and administrators gravitated toward Dr. Chen, discussing plans for improving the school's science program and creating new opportunities for students interested in medicine. The evening was drawing to a close, but its impact would be lasting. Students were already sharing the recorded videos, though not for the reasons Mrs. Richardson had feared earlier. Instead of capturing someone being thrown out of the ceremony, they had documented a powerful lesson about prejudice, dignity, and true excellence. As families began leaving the hall, the contrast between the evening's beginning and end couldn't have been clearer. Mrs. Richardson's attempt to exclude someone she deemed unworthy had instead exposed her own prejudices and forever changed the social dynamics at Preston Academy. Dr. Chen and Michelle were among the last to leave. As they walked past Mrs. Richardson, still standing alone near the exit, Dr. Chen paused briefly. "I have surgery scheduled early tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "Your husband might be interested to know that I'm operating on one of the hospital board members' children. We never know whose lives will intersect with ours, do we, Mrs. Richardson?" With those words hanging in the air, father and daughter walked out into the cool evening air, leaving behind a changed school community and a powerful reminder that true excellence comes in many forms, and none of them have anything to do with designer clothes or social status. The morning after the Academic Excellence ceremony, Preston Academy was buzzing with activity far earlier than usual. Students gathered in small groups before classes, their phones out, sharing videos of the previous night's events. The footage had spread rapidly through group chats and social media, though most students were less interested in the drama and more impressed by how the situation had been handled. In the teacher's lounge, the atmosphere was tense. Several faculty members sat quietly with their coffee cups, replaying their own inaction in their minds. Mr. Thompson, the chemistry teacher, kept checking his phone nervously. The school board was scheduled to have an emergency meeting that afternoon. "Did you see Mrs. Richardson's husband on the news this morning?" one teacher whispered to another. "He's making a huge donation to the hospital's community outreach program. Damage control, obviously." By mid-morning, Principal Walker had called an all-staff meeting. The usually confident administrator looked tired, as if he'd spent the night rehearsing what he needed to say. As teachers filed into the conference room, many noticed the thick stack of papers on the table, draft copies of a new anti-discrimination policy. Last night, Principal Walker began, his voice steady but serious. "We failed one of our best students. We stood by while she faced discrimination in what should have been her moment of triumph. This cannot happen again." The teachers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Through the conference room windows, they could see students heading to their classes, including Michelle, walking confidently with her friends, as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. "Dr. Chen called me this morning," Principal Walker continued. "He's not interested in punitive measures or public apologies. Instead, he's offered to help us establish a new scholarship program for underprivileged students interested in medicine." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very person who had faced discrimination was now leading the charge to create more opportunities for others. Meanwhile, in the school hallways, something remarkable was happening. Students who had never spoken up before were sharing their own stories of feeling out of place or judged. The incident had opened up a dialogue that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. By lunchtime, news arrived that Mrs. Richardson had resigned from the school board. Her resignation letter, which somehow found its way to the student newspaper, was filled with carefully worded apologies and vague references to personal growth opportunities. In the cafeteria, Michelle sat with her usual study group, helping a freshman with advanced biology homework. She had chosen not to hide or seek attention after the previous night's events. Instead, she continued being exactly who she'd always been, a dedicated student who helped others whenever she could. The afternoon brought more changes. The school board's emergency meeting resulted in several immediate policy changes. The dress code was revised to remove classist undertones. The parent volunteer committee was restructured to include more diverse voices. Even the school's mission statement was updated to explicitly mention inclusion and equity. But perhaps the most significant changes were happening in the small, everyday interactions. Teachers who had previously overlooked certain students were making extra efforts to engage with everyone equally. Students from wealthy families were reconsidering their assumptions about their peers. The social hierarchy that had seemed so important just days ago was beginning to crumble. Dr. Chen's influence extended beyond the school walls. At the hospital where he worked, administrators had launched a review of their own policies. Mrs. Richardson's husband, eager to distance himself from the incident, had become an enthusiastic supporter of diversity initiatives in the medical community. As the school day drew to a close, Principal Walker made an unexpected announcement over the intercom. The annual Parent Gala, traditionally an exclusive affair, would be transformed into a community celebration. The funds usually spent on elaborate decorations would instead go toward academic scholarships. In the parking lot after school, students noticed that the reserved parking spaces, once a symbol of status and privilege, had been redesignated. The spots closest to the entrance were now marked for students and faculty who had earned academic honors, regardless of their background. Michelle's last class of the day was advanced physics. As she solved complex equations on the board, her classmates watched with a new kind of respect. It wasn't just about her academic abilities anymore. They admired her dignity under pressure, her grace in victory, and her refusal to let anyone define her worth. The school newspaper's editorial board met after classes, debating how to cover the story. They eventually decided to focus not on the controversy, but on the positive changes it had sparked. The headline they chose was simple but powerful: Excellence Redefined. Preston Academy learns its greatest lesson. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the school's manicured lawns, the security guard who Mrs. Richardson had tried to call the previous night was chatting with Michelle about her college plans. He mentioned that his daughter was interested in medicine too, and Michelle immediately offered to share her study materials. The day ended with a quiet moment of reflection. Principal Walker stood at his office window, watching students leave for the day. He noticed how they interacted differently now, more inclusive, more aware, more kind. Sometimes, he realized, the most important lessons happen outside the classroom. In the hospital across town, Dr. Chen was preparing for another surgery. His phone buzzed with a message from Michelle, a photo of the new scholarship program announcement posted on the school bulletin board. He smiled, knowing that sometimes the most powerful changes come from standing firm in the face of prejudice, not with anger, but with dignity and grace. The events of that evening had triggered a transformation that went far beyond one school or one incident. It had sparked conversations in homes, offices, and classrooms across the city about privilege, assumptions, and the true meaning of excellence. And it all started because one student refused to let someone else's prejudice define her worth. 1 month after the incident at the Academic Excellence Ceremony, Preston Academy had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. The changes weren't just in official policies or public statements, they were visible in the small, daily interactions that made up school life. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly renamed Community Achievement Hall, formerly known as the Founders Hall. Inside, students from all backgrounds mingled freely, the invisible social barriers that had once divided them now largely forgotten. Michelle stood near the bulletin board, pinning up flyers for the new student mentoring program she'd helped establish. Next to her college acceptance letter to Johns Hopkins Medical School was a growing collection of acceptance letters from other students, state schools, community colleges, trade schools, and Ivy Leagues, all displayed with equal pride. "Have you seen the applications for the new scholarship program?" asked the school counselor, approaching with a thick stack of papers. "We've received more interest than we ever expected. Your father's initiative is changing lives already." The scholarship program, now officially named the Excellence Through Diversity Grant, had already secured funding for its first 5 years. Interestingly, some of the largest donations had come from families who had once been Mrs. Richardson's closest allies. In the Teachers' Lounge, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Faculty members now actively discussed ways to make their classes more inclusive and engaging for all students. The chemistry teacher, who had remained silent during the incident, had become one of the most vocal advocates for change. "My students' test scores have actually improved since we started the new inclusive study groups," he announced during a staff meeting. "It turns out when everyone feels welcome to participate, everyone benefits." The school newspaper had transformed too. Instead of focusing on social events and fundraising galas, it now featured stories about student achievements of all kinds. Today's headline read, "First Generation College Student Wins State Science Fair." Outside in the parking lot, Mrs. Richardson's old reserved parking space had been converted into a small garden. Students had planted flowers and installed benches, creating a space where anyone could sit and enjoy the sunshine. They called it the Unity Garden, though some jokingly referred to it as the Reality Check Park. During lunch period, the cafeteria buzzed with activity. The rigid social seating arrangements that had once defined lunch hour had dissolved. Student-led study groups occupied several tables, with upperclassmen helping younger students with their coursework. Michelle sat with a diverse group of students, explaining complex biology concepts while sharing her mother's homemade dumplings. "My dad always says that sharing knowledge is like sharing food," she told them. "There's always enough to go around, and everyone leaves satisfied." The impact extended beyond the school grounds. Local newspapers had picked up the story, leading other private schools in the area to examine their own policies and practices. The hospital where Dr. Chen worked had implemented new community outreach programs, offering medical career workshops for high school students from all backgrounds. Mrs. Richardson had relocated to another city, but her departure had sparked unexpected positive changes. Her former social circle had redirected their energy toward genuine community improvement. The Parent-Teacher Association now focused on meaningful initiatives rather than exclusive social events. In the guidance counselor's office, a new wall display showcased the diverse career paths of Preston Academy alumni. Photos of doctors worked alongside those of artists, mechanics, teachers, and entrepreneurs. Below them all was a simple quote, "Excellence comes in many forms." The annual school events calendar had been completely revamped. The exclusive parent gala had been replaced with a community festival celebrating student achievements. The admission events now emphasized academic merit and personal character rather than family connections. Dr. Chen had become a regular guest speaker at school assemblies, but not to talk about medicine. Instead, he shared stories about perseverance, dignity, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Students particularly loved his story about the night of the awards ceremony, though he always told it without mentioning names or assigning blame. The security team, once used to enforce unwritten social boundaries, now focused on genuine safety concerns. The guard who Mrs. Richardson had tried to call that night had enrolled in evening classes himself, inspired by the changes he'd witnessed. As the school year drew to a close, Preston Academy prepared for graduation. The ceremony would be different this year, more inclusive, more celebratory of genuine achievement rather than social status. Michelle had been chosen as valedictorian, her speech focusing on how one moment of confrontation had led to lasting positive change. The school board, now more diverse than ever, had approved a new motto, "Excellence through Unity." It replaced the old Latin phrase that nobody had really understood anyway. More importantly, it reflected the genuine transformation that had taken place. On the last day of school, Michelle stood in the Unity Garden, remembering the night that had started it all. A freshman approached her, clutching a biology textbook. "Is it true?" she asked. "The story about what happened at the award ceremony?" Michelle smiled, noting how the story had already become part of school legend. "Yes," she said, "but the important part isn't what happened that night. It's what happened afterward, how everyone came together to make real changes." As the sun set on another school day, the Preston Academy campus looked much the same as it always had: manicured lawns, historic buildings, proud tradition. But inside those buildings, everything had changed. The true lesson had been learned. Excellence isn't about exclusivity or status. It's about character, community, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And somewhere across town, in an operating room, Dr. Chen was teaching another young surgeon, passing on not just medical knowledge, but the wisdom that had guided his daughter that night. Sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is simply standing your ground with dignity and grace.